Welcome to SIM-PAC Live. I'm your host, Geoff Matthews, and today we interview Angeline Achariya, CEO of Innovation Gamechangers. Angeline is a transformative enterprise leader with 20 plus years of global experience across the agribusiness and food value chains. She has guided multi-billion-dollar organisations and successfully commercialised over 1,200 innovations, spanning product services, processes and business models. She is currently serving on nationally prominent boards, including Wine Australia, Industry Innovation Science Australia, Australia's Economic Accelerator, and the Victorian Multicultural Ministerial Business Council. Welcome, Angeline. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Geoff. Great to be here.
That's great. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I saw a post of yours on LinkedIn, caught my eye, and it said that we had to close the gap between innovation and productivity in Australia, and that you said that innovation and productivity are often seen as separate conversations. Can you expand on that for us?
Oh, I sure can. And don't you love LinkedIn, Geoff? It's a great post that we see from everybody there. And it's fantastic to be here to talk about that gap that I see and I've observed. Certainly, probably, Geoff, if I go back, it started from my very, very young age. I grew up in agriculture. I was immersed in that. I spent school holidays at my grandparents' farm. And I used to watch what I would call these small incremental innovations. How do you get a better irrigation system on the farm? How do you do a different planting methodology? How do you make sure that you're translating to a higher yield? And unbeknownst to me, those were through innovation, but nobody actually called it that back in the day, right? And then fast forward to about 25 years of a career in leading and commercializing innovations across products, process, services, and business models in leadership roles across some giant big companies, right? So like Mars, like Fonterra, Yum Brands, Mondelez, JR Simplot, and Monash Food Innovation. I've seen this pattern repeatedly, that companies that treat innovation as a separate from productivity struggled. And those that really understood that innovation is productivity actually went ahead and thrived in that space as well. So for me, I think if I start to look at this thing is, the mindset of innovation is really how we create productivity as opposed to looking at them in very, very separate. And I guess I always like to start with the problem, right? How do you define it? And at the end of the day, I think if you kind of sit here and you go, the current mindset as I observe it from the experience that I've had, I think we've created this artificial separation where innovation gets labeled as blue sky thinking, nice to have R&D, while productivity is more about, do more faster, do it cheaper. But really what I've learned is that you've got to commercialize all of these, and that innovation is how we create productivity. So it's the outcome, right? And
Yes.
Doesn't mean innovation then always has to be blue sky. For me, the way I define innovation is it's actually purposeful. You have to be purposeful in that creativity that is innovation, but how does it create value? And that value can be this big, it can be that big, or it can be huge.
Yes, and I think sometimes in our minds we think about innovation as new products, and we think about productivity is about manufacturing or making the products we've got more efficiently or at a cheaper cost.
And I'm sure there are people out there who think that, but I also know there are people out there who look at innovation and go, it's actually not just the productization of something, although
Yes.
that is the majority of it. It's the service. It's actually the process of how you do something. And
Yes.
I remember being in a large global organization where I was looking after sort of global innovation. One of our first innovation awards was given to an accountant.
Yes.
Would you believe? And everybody in the business was most surprised because, how can an accountant get an innovation award? Well, they did because they were able to actually establish and create value in the business through a process that they actually put in. And that is an example of innovation. So I think as leaders, we have to show different types of innovation. Otherwise, the status quo is its product, its process. And then I think on the other side, when you look at our whole startup space and creating new white space models, business innovation, business model innovation is also one of the key things. Sometimes we get so stuck in we've got to change the widget when actually it is the process of how you get more value from that widget along the supply chain.
Yes, absolutely. The process is important. I often say, people say to me about sustainable industrial manufacturing, where SIM-PAC comes from. And I say, it's not about building the widget. It's about building an economy that can make that widget sustainably. And that's the whole supply chain, from mineral extraction through to biogas and composting.
Absolutely. And it takes me back to a great example. So when I was at Mondelez, I actually co-led and co-founded a world first innovation model, right? And it was called the Food Innovation Center. And the business case there really wasn't about innovation for innovation's sake. We had a whole lot of headwinds around what was happening in manufacturing in the food sector. You know, it is one of the largest employers in the country, for instance. And it was really about how do we get productivity across the industry so we could grow that total pie together. So we needed to deliver more consumer value with fewer resources. We had to enter new markets and do it efficiently. We had to accelerate that time to market using new technology. So we were using in 2013 things like 3D printing, virtual reality that we introduced for planogramming in supermarkets, for instance. So thinking about and building industry-wide capability for small and medium enterprises. And the reason why we focused on that in food manufacturing is about 98% of manufacturers are small and mediums in food space, right? Yeah. So every innovation we had then commercialized through there, we had to prove that it would deliver more value with less input. And that ultimately for me is a definition of productivity, which only happens through the act of innovation.
Yes, because I noticed in your post, you said that it's not just about doing the same faster. That's a key, and that was one of the key questions I had. What was your measurable on what is productivity? And to small to medium businesses out there who are running to just get today's stuff done, putting out today's fires, how do you think they should be looking at productivity?
I think it's a really good question, and I'm a huge advocate of you've got to measure, right? So if I go to an example, when I was Chief Innovation and Tech Officer for Yum Brands, which is KFC, Pizza Hut, Taco Bell back in the day, we had to innovate constantly in that space, right? So whether it was new products, processes, or models, but each one of those was measured on productivity metrics. So for instance, can we serve more customers per hour? The number of cars through the drive-through, how do we reduce waste in the whole of the restaurant, for instance? You know, what was the satisfaction like with the same type of labor input metrics that we were putting in? And so for me, it was important to ensure that these outcome-based measures are absolutely stuck, but the way that you went about doing it was, again, innovate in terms of, okay, how do you get more customers per hour? How do you serve them? How do you get more efficiency through your drive-through? So those kind of things I think are important. And I would encourage the small and medium enterprises out there to really think through, what is the outcome that I'm trying to achieve? Yes. I think a lot of the times companies get so stuck on the inputs of what goes in and what I'm trying to do, and you get sort of stuck on, hang on, is it actually creating value? Because otherwise you create so much noise and it's just project for the sake of projects. We all know how all those ends up, right? Yes.
No, I'm doing an interview later this month with somebody in the area of refrigeration, and they were telling me that they did this with a company, Beefy's Pies in Queensland, where they took the wasted heat off the back of the refrigerator compressors and they used it to preheat the water, and they got the water for the washing up to 55 degrees. And what it meant is it increased the productivity of the whole food chain, because they could do the wash up faster and they never ran out of hot water because they were actually taking waste heat. And that's true innovation driving productivity.
And what a powerful story that is, right? But my question would be, did they see that as innovation or did they see that as productivity?
they saw it as energy conservation, and that's where it started. So they're trying to decarbonise and save dollars because energy is expensive, especially when you're using it at the wrong time in Queensland. And so they were trying to change the whole thing. So they were using low-cost solar during the day. They even changed what times they baked. That's, and there were all of this waste heat. We've created that energy. We've paid for it. We've used electricity to create that, and it's just being vented in the atmosphere. And to use that to preheat the water enabled the whole flow chain. And so probably the productivity was a nice outcome.
The byproduct
of an energy conservation, conserving energy in a circular way. But it's still a great story. And if one place has done it, then everyone with their refrigerated compressors could do it as well.
Following on from that example, one of the other areas that I wanted to talk about is, when you look at some of these things, particularly if I think about my role at Beanstalk AgTech at the minute, where we're running a drought venture studio, we're seeing the role of AI in the way that it's transforming decision making, particularly if you think about from an ag perspective. A farmer using AI-driven crop monitoring isn't doing innovation for innovation's sake. They're achieving higher yields, less water, less inputs of fertilizer and labor. And for me, that is another example of innovation through and getting the productivity outcome, for instance, right? And similarly in health models, we're seeing, health delivery, telehealth that came through, preventative care programs, all of these AI-assisted diagnostics. I don't think you can separate them from productivity. They're delivering better, healthier outcomes with fewer resources per patient, for instance. And that, again, is another example of innovation sort of enabling productivity as well. So I think all of these, Geoff, really kind of starts to, get me to ask some questions. If you look at Australia, we are quite unique when you think about it. We've got high labour costs, we've got skills that are constrained, we've got geographic distance from different markets as well. That old playbook of what I would say with respect was, work harder, cut costs, really I don't see working anymore. I think what we need is this innovation playbook that gives you those productivity outcomes, which is really around working smarter, finding new value and better ways to do that. And technology, of course, can help us get there. When you look at our constrained sort of economy, I think with the skill shortages that we haven't been able to achieve productivity through more labour input. So for me, if you need innovation in your process, in your technologies, in your business model, right? And I think the role of AI coming in is not going to replace humans. It's actually going to make us a lot more productive as we go through. So how do we start to step into that? And earlier we sort of touched a little bit on export. And I think in my experience in sort of exporting, particularly into Asia, I constantly see Australian companies sort of competing on innovation-driven productivity. So whether that's about your unique value proposition that you offer back to the product or the service or the capability, it's around superior efficiency, really breaking through with capabilities that succeed. And then it's competing solely on traditional cost matrix. It's the ones that actually struggle is because they're competing on cost. And I think the cost piece is, straight down to the end game at the end of the day.
Yes, I interviewed Craig Nichol from the Graphene Manufacturing Group recently, and he said, have better tech, be faster and cheaper. And they're leading the world in what they're doing. But it was interesting. It was have better tech and be faster and be agile. So can we come back to, so we've talked a little bit about productivity and innovation, the differences. What are your suggestions for closing this gap? And why is there a gap? I mean, I know when you start researching the subject, it says this is well documented in Australia. Productivity hasn't been increasing in the past decade. And we've got world-class research institutes and great innovation coming through on that level. Why is there a gap? And then let's go from then, what can we do about it?
So I think there's all of those reasons on why there is a gap, right? And I don't think there's a silver magic bullet that actually will answer to closing the gap. So let's take, for example, when we talk about looking at our current sort of the way that businesses work, we sit here and we look at innovation as a very separate thing, as a separate bucket. when really it is the process of how you get to the outcomes, whether they're sustainability outcomes, their circular economy outcomes, or their productivity outcome. And my encouragement would be for leaders to really start to look at, in their strategic plans, how are they actually also going to measuring productivity? So in the businesses I've been in, productivity tends to be, as I said, faster, cheaper, and less with less, right? But if you come with that mind frame, you're always going to be looking at taking something out. Whereas for me, it's actually about how do you create value that is sustainable. So what does productivity look like around value creation, which still then helps you kind of go with less, maybe cheaper, maybe not cheaper, but actually makes you efficient at the end of the day. So that disconnect, I think, between innovation and productivity needs to come much closer. And I don't think it's seeing both of them as separate, but looking at them as one that benefits the other. And it's the way that we do it. So if I go back to your comment around, we are very, very good in Australia around our research discipline, our ability to, we rank very, very highly in the country. But where we probably don't do so well is how do we translate and commercialize that research to outcome, to value. And that disconnect, again, I think stems from this whole view of what is innovation and therefore what is the outcome that you're looking for, which you could take productivity as one or sustainability or something else, for instance. So they would be probably my views on, how do you integrate this innovation thinking into our productivity strategy, or let alone your business strategy. You don't even have to call it a productivity strategy, right? And then how is the act of the innovation that you're doing actually impacting your efficiency, like the freezer company that you said, and creating value, which for them has created value all the way through, right? So building those innovation capabilities as productivity capabilities, I think, is one way to start to lessen that gap and the separation that we see.
Yes. From my point of view, or SIM-PAC's point of view, when we look at these companies, especially around energy consumption, which is the biggest way to decarbonise, we're also seeing a lot of decarbonisation projects or efforts actually leading to productivity. And the reason that there's been no productivity gains in certain areas is that we've had cheap fossil fuels, or relatively cheap fossil fuels, available 24/7 for the last 100 odd years. And so we've built up a whole lot of economic paradigms and a whole lot of industrial processes that just rely on, and they haven't had to be efficient. And now you're starting to have energy coming into the grid that's very expensive at some times and very cheap at other times. And you've got to re-examine your industrial processes. And I see some really great gains in that area, but that's driven by high energy prices at certain times of the day. And I see some innovation around there, but I don't see the innovation coming from some of the great new tech startups and being scaled up. That's where I see that. I see even the SIM-PAC Live members, we've got that. There's a whole bunch of startups in one corner and there's bigger operational companies in the other. And you can see that, look, they could use these products, but that gap is, you get them in the same room talking, but there's still barriers there. How do you see overcoming that?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think, we've done a fantastic job in Australia around building our entrepreneurship, our startup landscape. I don't think, if I sit here to be truly honest, I don't think we have a startup problem anymore in Australia. We have a scale-up problem.
Yes.
And the reason is back to that example, why is it that we still don't have the adoption of those technologies or the problems that could be solved by SMEs and large corporates? The other way is, do our startups, are they in the right conversations to really understand what are some of the critical problems and the challenges? And one thing I do know, if you look at some of the big, hairy challenges that we've talked about circular economy, sustainability, all of these things, it won't be one company that can actually solve for these. No, we are going to have to come together to do that. So I think one of the, perhaps, and it's not an answer, but my hypothesis would be is that when you have businesses that truly want to innovate and get that outcome of productivity, sustainability, whatever it is, I think that's when you start to step in. So it's the desire to do that, as you said, on the back of that other example of, the cost wasn't just there, so we just kept going the same way. And a lot of the times I think we see companies, there's so many things to solve when you're in a business, and I've been in there, right? You just don't have the headspace.
Yes.
So what actually makes you step into this actually ahead of the curve, or ride the wave of the curve as you're actually stepping, in that business framework as well. So for me, it's the organizations that treat innovation as their primary productivity strategy, rather than seeing it as a separate thing, I think are the ones that probably have a greater chance of stepping into this space.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Innovation rather than the cost cutters. Look, I want to jump back to your grandparents' farm, all the way back there, because I want to throw
It was a long time ago.
Well, but I want to throw something at you. It sounds to me that they had a process in their minds of continual improvement, and that's something that I love companies and I love people, human beings that even have this process of today. How do I get up and how do I continually improve and how do I be better? And if we adopted continual improvement, would it help with the adoption of innovation? Because that continual improvement is asking, what can I do better? How can I do it better? And that's linking innovation to productivity.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. So having worked in Japan when I was at Mars, what I loved about the Japanese culture was Kaizen. You're continuously looking at the improv of something. I happen to be wired that way, so I naturally do that anyway, whether it's work or life or anything else, or it drives my husband batty sometimes. But one of the things I think is absolutely asking the question, how do I do this better? However, I think one thing that I will share, having worked across the world in different large and smaller organizations across different cultures, one of the things I also observed is that there is a certain protection of the status quo.
Yes.
So people don't want things to change because it makes it harder. I need to learn a new skill. I need to do something differently. I need to go and influence my leaders to get a project in, right? I fundamentally do feel, and particularly being in the innovation space, where the challenges are actually less about getting the project approved at the board level, at the C-suite level. It's actually more about the people who are in there every day and their willingness to ask those questions, as you say.
Yes. And that brings me to procurement, because you touched on it before. And I've seen this, that great startups in Australia with great innovation, great products, and people who agree they're great, but trying to get into the procurement schedule of the larger companies that's a door. It's almost impossible to get in. And sometimes it's not that. Sometimes their products are cheaper, and they certainly can be less carbon intensive, in the space that we're looking at. How do we bring procurement up to speed? Because procurement is that protecting the status quo. It's somebody's job. I order these from that person and I've done it and I've signed a contract for 10 years and because, I know it and it'll do the job. But how do we get into a procurement mindset that because we can't do it all, procuring is a way to bring increased productivity, and procurement is a way to bring innovation into your business that you can increase your productivity.
Absolutely. And the third one I'd add to that is procurement is a way to actually scale, new technologies as they come through as well. I think we have to be deliberate in this space. It's kind of like this thing of, we look at productivity or innovation as separate, and then we'll say, actually, as long as you launch the widget, let's take it, it'll be fine. And then we have this problem of the scale up that you actually can't get through the valleys of death that we have to sort of navigate through. So for me, procurement absolutely needs to be a prime focus. It has to be part of the strategy of actually enabling that pull through that you need. And we know around the world, countries that have been, that kind of say, we will focus on this aspect of technology creation. So it could be, from, if we're seeing AI technology, they are looking at everything from discovery, they're looking at the application of that, they're looking at then how it actually builds capability, all the way to procurement to ensure that you have that whole end-to-end cycle of adoption, diffusion, and then getting it to scale. And I think we sometimes perhaps compartmentalize and don't look at the whole chain of an innovation and that role. And presumably, maybe my hypothesis, it goes back to that definition of innovation is big blue sky stuff that's going to come and rock the world, for instance. I don't think that's only the role of innovation, for instance.
Yeah. And so what about the role of our academic institutions? And we know that they are creative and they are world leading, and we also know that there's a gap between them and industry. I've recently been talking to 10 universities and we've been talking exactly about this subject. What's your view on that? I mean, you're out there, you've worked for some of these big companies, these billion-dollar companies. Tell me, how do we improve that? How do we improve that relationship where industry is more involved with research or is closer to those universities?
Well, good luck with a 10 university conversation, firstly. And so, Geoff, that disconnect that you talked about between research and industry, I think one of the things that I have observed is that, and the research already shows this here, right? When you have this thing of proof of concept and proof of scale, we tend to fail in that space all the time. And the reason is it's not because we're getting the science wrong. My hypothesis is that we haven't connected the research to real world problems that customers are willing to pay to solve. And this is when I was sitting in industry, my conversations were always actually getting our researchers and academics to appreciate our landscape of where the business was operating and what our key problems were. Because a lot of the times I'd have lots of proposals come through my desk that will say, I want to solve for this. Would you please support this? And I'd go, hang on, this has got nothing to do with our business, right? So, I think it's an appreciation of really understanding what are the problems to solve and how does academic research, which is stellar in our country, actually work to enable that so that we can translate those research as an industry back to the customer problems and the solutions that we need to solve. So if we can look at, I don't think it's a funding issue. I think it's fundamentally an understanding of what it takes to solve some of these multi-dimension problems and the role that science can play. And I really do think science can play and actually help us in this space, if only we can understand each other's problems.
Okay, look, I want to talk about taxation incentives quickly. And I know you might be challenged to get too deep in this because of your board obligations. But from what I see, when I look around at other countries that are doing this successfully, there's no two systems that are alike. It's not like anyone's got a magic bullet and there's a whole bunch of countries that have copied their systems. So, there's obviously people are trying to push different buttons and see what one works. But the ones that look as though they are doing it most successfully are trying to incentivize keeping the innovation in country. And this is the second part of this question on this tax, but it's because I wonder if we're exporting our innovation, and that because we've got this gap, and you said we don't have a startup problem, we've got a scale-up problem, and I'm seeing these startups looking at going to EU or the United States to scale up, and we're losing them, because there's not the right incentive in place, and also they look at those markets as being much bigger and much more, and are more able to get in capital, more able to scale up. And so, as I said, the only thing I can look through the other ones and say, well, that taxation looks quite interesting because they obviously are rewarding innovation that stays in country with future taxation. Give us the views that you can give us.
Okay, the views that I can give us. So I fundamentally do believe, and I've seen this firsthand, is the incentive through a scheme like an R&D tax is very, very critical, whether you're a startup, you're a medium, or you're a large business. So ways that we can maximize that return, I think, will only make good business sense, because the cost of doing business before COVID as a benchmark to after COVID with all the supply chain and all the geopolitical complexities that we're seeing is really, really challenged. So ways that we can, I think, enable and incentivize is going to be important, but so is going to be procurement, which we talked about earlier as well, and how we support. I do know from an Australian perspective, whenever I've tried to scale new tech innovation in Australia, we've had to always have an eye offshore just because we are never going to be large enough size. So, your boards are not approving those kind of capitals and things like that as well. So I don't feel like it's one answer. It's multi-pronged, and having certainly the right tax definitions and incentives available to all sorts of companies is going to be really, really critical, particularly in that establishment phase, so that you can skip that first valley of death towards scale up.
Wonderful. Look, that's all the questions I had for you today. It's been a delight to meet you and talk to you today. Thank you so much for coming in. I don't know if we've solved any of the world's problems, but certainly we've aired a few things out that I think needed to be aired out, and I hope the viewers enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, and thank you, Geoff. And if you don't mind, just probably one kind of closing thought and encouragement to those listening out there. I do feel, 25 years working in industry, I feel like the time to act is now. You could ask me why the time to act wasn't before. But we're sitting here in quite a VUCA world today, and it's only going to get even more so, right? So we have fantastic research excellence, which we talked about. We've got the entrepreneurial spirit that has really been sort of building. We've got fantastic market opportunities sitting in Australia with all the great stuff that we have been working on. We just need to connect that innovation, productivity in every conversation and in every strategy, I think, as well, right? And the investment decision. So that's how I think we will truly build that thriving, future-ready Australia that we all want to be part of, that we all want to contribute to. So that's an encouragement from me to anyone listening out there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Angeline.
Thank you, Geoff.